This is Algebra 2 with Trig, Unit 4.2b. We'll be talking about how to determine the equations for inverse functions. First, we've got to talk about our notation. If f of x represents a function, then the notation f inverse of x, it'll read f inverse of x, will be used to denote the inverse of f of x. Similarly, g inverse of x will be used to denote the inverse of g of x. So your function's name has to match the correct letter. So for f, we're going to use f inverse, and if we're using g inverse, then that'll be working with the g function. The -1 does not mean we have a fraction with a function in the denominator. Alright, to find equations. So we're going to be given an equation, and we want to find the inverse of this equation. We know how to graph this, we know how to make a table, we know how to sketch what the inverse might be, but what is the equation? If necessary, like in this situation, replace f of x with y, switch the variables x and y, and solve for the new y using inverse notation. So here's our first one. We already have it as y, so we're going to switch the x and the y. We'll add the 4 across because we're going to solve for y. X plus 4 equals 7y. Then we divide by 7. And it would be nice if we can break this up to look more like slope-intercept form. So this would be 1 over 7, because it's 1/7, x plus 4/7. That is our new y value. So our best way to write this, since it's an inverse, it would be better if it came from f inverse, function notation there, but f inverse of x equals 1/7 x plus 4/7. Here we're using f of x, so we have to first switch that over to a y, so it's not quite as complicated looking. Then we're going to switch our x and the y around. So we just put the y where the x was. Then we'll subtract the 2 across. And then we'll divide by the 5. The -5 to be exact. So we're going to break this down as -1 over 5 because the coefficient is a 1. 1/5, but it's negative. 2 negatives. Oh, this is 1/5 x. 2 negatives make a positive 2/5. And we can write that as f inverse of x. So you go ahead and start to think, what are you going to need to do to make this an inverse? What is the inverse of this graph? Well, it's not a graph, it's an equation. But what's the inverse of this equation? We're going to switch our x and the y. Now, mathematically, how do we work with this? I would suggest of multiplying by 3. Then you would want to distribute Three times 5 is 15. Let's be sure that looks like a plus. Then we're going to go through and divide by the 2. We can divide everything by the 2. So we're 3 over 2x plus 15 over 2. I'd suggest you not use decimals. And since we're all done, we can call this f inverse of x. Because this was the f function, this would be the inverse of x. Notice how this one is g. We're still going to start out with y. And we'll switch our x and the y, but notice what happens. Only the x switches, not the negative with it. Subtract the 7 across. Then when we try to divide by a negative, that gives us negative x, positive 7, and that's going to be g inverse of x, because our original function was named g. We write our function as y, switch the x and the y, and then solve for y. Multiply, or actually subtract the 9 across. Multiply by the 4, it's got to multiply both terms. Then we're going to divide by the 3. So it's going to be 4 over 3x minus, divided by 3 would give you 12. And this would be h inverse of x. Okay, now we have a story problem. You can always pause the video at any spot if you need to catch up. I'd encourage you to rewind it and listen to it again. What did you miss? What don't you understand? How did this happen? Okay, a small company produces greeting cards. The cost C in dollars of producing n greeting cards per month can be modeled by this function. Now this is very important. Do not switch variables when finding inverse or inverses of these word problems. Okay, this would be confusing because the letters are chosen to represent real life quantities. So we're going to find the inverse of our model. So we're starting out with C equals 360 plus 0.60 n. I'm going to subtract the 360. Remember, just talked about, don't represent that as switching C and N. Now, I don't like a decimal. How am I going to divide by a decimal? So we're going to turn this into a fraction. This is 60 over 100. That is 6 over 10. That is 3 over 5. Now I can multiply by 5. That's 15, and then 300, which is 1800. And then we'll divide by 3. So we have 5/3 C minus, and divide by 3, 600. Here we know what the cost is when you plug in the number of cards. And now I know the amount of cards I can make if there's going to be a certain cost. Use the inverse function to find the number of greeting cards produced when in a month when the company's total cost is $615. So we're going to take 5/3 of 615 and minus 600. That's going to give me the number of greeting cards. Well, I can divide here, and this goes into there 2 times 205. So I get 5 times 205 minus 600. This looks like 1,025 minus 600. That should give me 425 cards. 425 greeting cards. See ya.